and you have the stage now.
Great, thank you very much, and apologies for the delay. Yes, so without further ado, sorry about that again. I'm Michael Stark, and the topic of this presentation is cryptocurrencies in 2021, record highs and lows. And we're going to be discussing some of the key reasons why cryptocurrencies made such strong gains so far in 2021, some of the reasons why they've dropped from the highs, and some of the possible ways that traders could exploit the relatively high volatility that cryptocurrencies have seen so far this year. My name is Michael Stark, as I say. I am an associate of the Society of Technical Analysts for a couple of years, and I've been working at Exness specifically for about 3 years, and generally trading CFDs about 8 years roughly, with a focus on cryptocurrencies specifically over the last about 5 years approximately. So what we're going to do is just have a very quick presentation. It should take probably no more than about 15 or 20 minutes, after which we should have plenty of time for any questions that you might want to ask. And I believe there is a live translation, but if there's not, then feel free to ask me a question, and I can clarify anything that you might have missed. So before we get started properly, you do need to be aware that trading is risky. You need to consider your experience. Remember that the CFDs involve high risk of loss. Trading is not suitable for everybody. None of the information here is a recommendation to trade anything. The presentation is for educational purposes only, and any financial decision you make is at your own risk. And we should bear in mind, all of us listening here, that CFDs on crypto are particularly risky compared with CFDs on Forex or on for commodities. So it's not something that you should start with. Shouldn't start preferably trading CFDs with cryptocurrencies. So what's basically been going on is that most of us probably will have heard about the fact that Bitcoin has reached all-time highs earlier this year. In April, I believe it was the 14th of April, it reached about 65,000, slightly higher depending on the exchange, which is an all-time high, and since then has dropped quite significantly, especially towards the end of May. And some of the key factors behind that include the Chinese crackdown. Legally speaking, China has tightened its regulations against crypto mining, which has reduced the hash rate for Bitcoin. That's probably just a temporary thing, but given the important role of sentiment in crypto markets, that's something that has affected the prices of most major-ish altcoins and, of course, Bitcoin significantly. But at the same time, pretty much everywhere in the world, we've got record easy monetary policy and very strong fiscal stimulus in many countries as well. Pretty much every major advanced economy has rates close to zero or negative. So the hunt for interest is something that's definitely been very important over the past few months, the past year actually, and that's something we're going to discuss a little bit more shortly. And also now, coinciding actually quite neatly with the latest major coins, is the shift in the narrative away from inflation generally in markets towards economic growth, which has been driven by the Fed. We're also going to mention some more details about that in just a So basically, I think, the other traders think as well, that the basic reasons why you would be positive on Bitcoin and other crypto are still there. They are still active, but sentiment has taken quite a strong dent, let's say, over the past few weeks. And sentiment is something that's really crucial in crypto markets. So it could go either way from a fundamental perspective, and from a technical perspective too in some cases. And we're going to discuss that in just a couple of minutes. If we look at hodlers, that is to say, people who aren't simply holders but who are quite committed holders, roughly about half the current supply of Bitcoin is still not liquid. Compared with at the end of last year, the figure was something like about 75-80%. Supply of Bitcoin in particular wasn't liquid, it wasn't moving, and most of the transactions, quite a large majority of transactions on Bitcoin's blockchain, were not between different holders, just people moving Bitcoin from one place to another. Now that has certainly increased, but still about half of the total. If we look at this chart on the left here, which hopefully you can see clearly enough, it's from Glassnode, and see that in general the number of holders have come down quite significantly over the second quarter of 2021, but it started to stabilise and long-term holders started to reaccumulate at the end of June. I mean, in general, it's a function of paper hands to diamond hands, to use the popular terms. Paper hands, that is to say, people who are holders, but they're somewhat nervous and somewhat reluctant to do so in specific circumstances where panic, or not necessarily panic, but let's say nervousness is quite high in markets. And diamond hands are more keen to hold regardless of the cost. So still, as before, as we saw in the first quarter of this year and as we saw in the fourth quarter of 2020, there's really a lot of people who are quite keen to stay in, just hold on for dear life, as it stands for. Although, of course, some people have got out as a result of the latest decline, which is happening last month and this month. They're not by any means the big majority. And in general, Bitcoin is being adopted and used for various purposes a lot more. This big dip, which has taken place over the last couple of months, has attracted value investors. I put that in inverted commas because, of course, establishing Bitcoin's value is quite difficult. That much stuff, really, that you can do with it in terms of buying, given that it's more really like a inflation defensive asset than it is like a currency. And the value in exchanges we've seen, if we look at this chart on the right here, has stabilised towards the end of June and increase. Typically, but not always, typically, as the value on exchanges of Bitcoin decreases, we can usually expect that the price is going to go up. Typically, but not always. I want to stress that because people are using it to do different things. They're using it for DeFi. They're using it for any kind of other interest scheme that isn't necessarily on an exchange, or they're staking it using any number of crypto companies, whether as part of a supercharger or as part of crypto, or for any reason they're staking it. That generally, but I would stress, not always indicates that the value of Bitcoin is going to go up with lower value on exchanges. And now, after we've seen this bounce in the amount of value, which is in yellow here, it's been held on exchanges towards the end of May. It seems to stabilise this month. And I mean, in general, looking very generally at this point, the number of exchanges and their accessibility all around the world, in the Middle East and in Africa and in Asia, definitely, the numbers increased massively, and Bitcoin's visibility generally among the kind of average person has increased quite significantly over the past year, in particular as the price has increased enormously after the crash in March 2020. So in general, Bitcoin is much more popular, and I mean it's still significantly more popular as an investment and as a hedge against inflation than it had been about a year ago. Although, of course, there has been some retreat in its popularity as the price has gone down. And the people who invest in Bitcoin is certainly correlated with the kind of return that they might expect. And at the same time, it doesn't usually go up forever. So the final key point of this, the fundamental section, is on inflation and monetary policy. Now, those of you who are watching the Federal Open Market Committee's meeting, which was about 2 weeks ago, exactly 2 weeks ago, I believe, they've now started to project tightening monetary policy significantly earlier than had been before. Quite possibly there's going to be two in 2023, that's meant to say, and not 2022, and one in 2022. And the reduction of quantitative easing is expected to take place more strongly and sooner than had previously been expected. So this in general has shifted the kind of focus of markets away from inflation, and most kinds of inflation defensive assets over the last couple of weeks have retreated, at least to some degree. Bitcoin fairly strongly, and other cryptocurrencies fairly strongly, yes. Also gold has retreated after having reached on highs. It's gone back down again over the last last couple of weeks. And we've also seen that defensive shares have started to be rotated out of, and people have generally started to attack in cyclical shares such as tech. Not always, but in general in the USA, that's what we've seen happening. Now we've got old economy shares, inverted commas, aren't really going up so much anymore. That is to a great degree an inflation defensive asset. So, while the narrative inflation isn't in focus so much anymore now that the Fed has indicated they're going to do something about it, still inflation is there. Now look at this chart here. We're looking at American Consumer Price Index. It's reached a full 5% last year, which is the highest since the third quarter of 2008. So inflation is really quite high. And it doesn't really look like it's going to go back down anytime, given the fact that the Fed doesn't plan on its first hike until next year at the earliest. They have abandoned their strict target for inflation at 2%. Yes, that's true, but still, with inflation at this kind of level, people are quite keen to look for interest. The hunt for interest, as we've been calling it, is certainly on. And crypto is one of the relatively few ways to get a non-trivial rate of interest in assets, whether through crypto earn or whether through decentralized finance, DeFi for short, and various other similar kinds of schemes offered by exchanges that get paid about 6.5%, 8.5%, I think now, on crypto earn, which is something as traders concerns us because the demand for transferable cryptocurrencies, as it goes up, then the price of the CFD is usually going to go up as well. We're not necessarily immediately concerned with the reasons, but that is something that we should be aware of and try to monitor, just because it's often going to give a sense as to what's going to happen. So certainly the overall picture for Bitcoin and for other cryptocurrencies isn't quite as negative as the charts would try to tell us. It's a reflection, to a great extent, it's a reflection of how nervousness has been quite high. Sentiment is very important and that's something that that's affected the price negatively. Right, so now we're just going to take a quick look at three of these charts and look at the technical view for these charts, which is Bitcoin against the dollar, Ether against the dollar, Ethereum, the blockchain, that is to say, and Litecoin against the dollar. But if you want us to take a look at anything else, any other major-ish cryptocurrency, then we can certainly do that. Just ask a question, please. It's the end. What was that? Sorry. I was thinking it was Zoom for a minute there. Yes. Oh, sorry. Right. So looking firstly at Bitcoin, this is a daily chart. And I mean, in general, the bounce so far from the latest low does look fairly strong, although, I mean, it is early days yet. This is just a daily chart, it's not a weekly chart. We can see that price has moved down. It's reached its high in April, around 13, 14, 15 April, that kind of area. And then after the initial kind of movement down, retraced upwards somewhat, and then move fairly sharply down from about the middle of May. But we can notice, and I think this is really key, there hasn't actually been a really strong movement below 30,000. Yes, it has tested below 30,000, that kind of psychological support area, but it actually hasn't moved significantly below there, and it hasn't had a daily close below there. Apart from in the middle of June, there's been 2 days basically was closed below there. And that coincides actually quite neatly with the 50% Fibonacci retracement area, which is the area from which traditionally most traders would expect that bounce is most favourable. Resumption of the main trend, for that matter, even is most favourable. So, I mean, in general, it looks like this is a fairly strong support around 30,000, given the presence of the lower area, 61.8% area of the weekly Fibonacci fan, plus the Fibonacci retracement, and I mean in general recovering sentiment to some degree. One of the key factors that we need to be aware of as traders, one of the key opportunities of course of the current situation is buying low. High, we don't want to sell low as traders, of course we want to buy low, But how do you know that you're not catching a knife? It's a very important question. Given the structure of the price over the last roughly 6 weeks, slightly less than 6 weeks, let's say about 5 to 6 weeks, we've seen that it's actually been fairly stable, relatively speaking, for say that is, and it's moved basically sideways. It's shown quite a considerable reluctance to push lower, and that is possibly a sign that buying in here doesn't necessarily mean catching the knife. But the question, of course, is it going to move anytime soon significantly above the 38.2% Fibonacci retracement area? We don't know yet. It's certainly, I think, it's just my opinion, it would require some sort of catalyst, some sort of positive above that area. And right now that doesn't seem to be forthcoming. But possibilities certainly include relatively weaker economic data, given that the focus is likely to move back towards that somewhat now that inflation is out of specific focus. General economic data such as the NFP, such as GDP data, these sorts of things that are normally quite important, probably likely to return to focus. Or of course, meeting of the FOMC, of the Fed, that is to say, in which hawkishness is somewhat less, that would be an obvious factor. But certainly for the moment, we're not looking at this. I don't think most traders are seriously considering Bitcoin moving back up to test its all-time high anytime particularly soon. Just equally, on the other side, that 30,000 is quite a strong support. So the opportunities of sideways trading, for Bitcoin now, they're quite good. At the same time, the opportunity for buying in low and possibly selling out again higher are potentially quite good, but you might be waiting in there for quite a long time. And this is one of the advantages if you do choose to trade CFDs. One of the advantages of trading CFDs on crypto with Bitcoin is that all cryptocurrencies by default, regardless whether you live in a Muslim country, you have a swap-free account or not, all of them are swap-free. So if you want, you can replicate buy and hold strategies with Bitcoin and with other cryptocurrencies, regardless who you are. Live. There's possibly an advantage, and relatively speaking, the spreads on this are actually quite competitive. So it's certainly something to think about if you want to trade with leverage, if you feel that that's for you, as opposed to using transferable cryptocurrency. So a quick look as well at Ether against the dollar. We can see here that the technical structure is broadly quite similar to Bitcoin against the broadly, just the move upwards towards the high in early May 2021 was much sharper than for Bitcoin. Bitcoin reached its high a bit earlier in April, but also the initial move downwards was also pretty sharp. So in some respects it seems to have formed a shoulders pattern, fairly weakly defined one, that's true, but a head and shoulder pattern can identify the somewhere around here in these two areas, just in early June for the second shoulder and for the left shoulder mid-April roughly, around when Bitcoin reached its high. Then the neckline, the head itself in May. But of course we've seen actually hasn't been followed through by strong we've got similar Fibonacci areas that have been in considerable focus, I would say, over the last few weeks, over the last 1 or 2 weeks in particular. The 50%, same as for Bitcoin, that is traditionally to be self-fulfilling prophecy, inverted commas, and research itself from that area, and equally 61.8% area of the Fibonacci fan. Both of these are quite important. And I mean, certainly if we look at the pattern of candlesticks, I know this is a bit small, but if you squint a little bit you can hopefully see it. We've got upward three soldiers, it's called, people call that various, but I mean the point is the three large real bodies of these candlesticks going upwards, usually taken in the context to be quite a strong buy signal, given that the kind of macro trend on the weekly charts is clearly upward. That's something certainly that a lot of people have been looking at. And I mean, Ethereum, purely from a fundamental perspective, also probably looks somewhat stronger than Bitcoin, given partially the fact that the price is much lower. Many people who are looking at cryptocurrencies interested in buying, they might just look at the price and say, hey, this is only about $2,000 and something dollars, in euros yesterday. I think it was about 1,900 roughly. Whereas if you look at Bitcoin, hey, this is about 35,000, a little bit below that, it's like more than 10 times the price. So let's buy this one instead, Ethereum. That's how many people think anyway. And equally, if we look at rates for DeFi, for crypto and similar schemes as we've discussed before, for Ethereum, it's usually about the same as Bitcoin, or in many cases actually somewhat higher than Bitcoin. Not for crypto, and that's true, but for DeFi, traditionally Ethereum is the main currency used, cryptocurrency used for these protocols, and for interest schemes, it's about Bitcoin. So from a fundamental perspective, my personal opinion would be the Ether actually looks probably stronger than Bitcoin at the moment. But equally, we do have those questions of how likely is it to reach a new all-time high very soon. But that is to say, within the next couple of months, it doesn't seem all that likely. Of consolidation, at least until there's some kind of significant new information coming to it, is something that I think is quite likely. So that's something certainly to watch. It's a bit stronger than Bitcoin. Whereas with Litecoin, probably from both perspective, technical and fundamental, looks I think the weakest of these three that we're looking at here. Part of the reason for fundamentally it's not being very strong is that, the focus has just shifted to lots of different altcoins from Litecoin. The price is quite high, and obviously in the first quarter in particular, the altcoin that was kind of, apart from Bitcoin and Ethereum anyway, the altcoin that was the main view was Dogecoin. Many of us will remember that, and we've also got Cardano, and Polkadot. Various other altcoins that have been, just in much more focus than Litecoin so far this year. And this one, Litecoin, isn't particularly widely used for interest schemes. It's actually not really very widely used at all for interest schemes. So, if you were going to sell one of them from fundamental, and I think also from a technical, probably looks like the best candidate for selling is going to be, so in this case, this chart looks like a mess, yes, I realise, but it's important, I thought, to add both the daily Fibonacci retracement, which is in white, and we've got the weekly Fibonacci retracement of Fibonacci, which is in yellow. And we've seen that in this case, it has moved below the 50% weekly Fibonacci retracement and below the Fibonacci fan quite significantly, and so far it doesn't show that much signs, let alone a strong bounce. Seems to be quite happy to languish down here at relatively low prices, like really quite significantly less than half of the all-time high. And there just doesn't, so far, seem to be that much volume, either of safeties or deliverable volume, shoot back up again for it to retest the highs. So, in general, what we're looking at is Bitcoin is moderately strong, both technically and fundamentally, I think, considering the circumstances. But Ethereum, fundamentally and probably technically, is stronger than Bitcoin. I think it'll be strong of all of these. So the key question is, as traders, how do we exploit these movements, and what do we do? And one of the things that we want to avoid doing where possible is catching the knife. But at the same time, we also, if there's a good opportunity, we want to get involved relatively quickly, because cryptocurrencies are very volatile and they change quite quickly in terms of price, that is to say. So one of the key things that traders are still looking for now, as they had been doing last year, is what are whales doing? Whales in terms of Bitcoin, there are various different definitions, there's quite a few, but one fairly common definition is whale is anybody who has about 20 or more Bitcoins. That is to say, roughly about $750,000 worth of Bitcoin. Of course, the bigger the whale, the more obvious their activity tends to be on a chart. So traders sit there looking out for what big whales are doing. And one of the factors there that not necessarily give away, but give hints as to what whales are doing, is when we've seen a fairly strong period of gains, followed by quite a sudden retracement downwards, an indication that whales are taking profits and they're selling out at least part of their holdings. And at the same time, if we look at when you have quite a strong bounce after having reached a notable new low or touched a notable new low, not necessarily with a close, that often suggests that whales are wanting to buy the dip and accumulate more. We don't really have a clear signal for this on this time frame now, and that's certainly true. But if we were to see, for example, a move back above the 38.2% weekly Fibonacci area, quite a large real body upward for one of these candlesticks, then that would be an indication that whales are buying in, and it's something that we as kind of average retail traders, or me at least as a kind of average retail trader, might want to follow. And the opposite would also hold true if there's a significant movement below the 30,000, the psychological support, the main one, I think. Then that's quite possibly something we might want to consider selling into, especially if that movement comes in terms of a large real body downward for a period on a daily chart after a period of gains. My personal opinion is it's not really that likely that Bitcoin is going to test below 30,000 unless, of course, there's some kind of significant new negative information that comes to markets. But still, it's just something that I think is worth considering. And something that we should also bear in mind, I think, for Ethereum in particular, is when we're looking at trading with XNES, the spread for this has decreased quite significantly. Still, it becomes definitely more viable for short-term trading to long-term trading, as we discussed before with swap-free. The spread for this now can be as low as about 30 pips much of the time. So that's actually about half from where it was a couple of months ago. So it definitely makes short-term trading more compared with the typical kind of spreads that you'd have to pay on cryptocurrencies. It's not as low as Forex, of course, a spread of about 30 pips high in terms of Forex pairs, but given a cryptocurrency, it's quite low, it's quite a competitive spread. So certainly something that's worth considering. In general, I think that's about it for me. If you have any questions, please ask them. I'm just going to open the floor in 1 minute for questions. And I would also like to remind you, if you won't stay for questions or if you don't want to ask for any reason, please remember to trade responsibly. Cryptocurrencies are very risky compared to other types of CFD. And you do need to manage risk, even if you've got really good signals, and even if you think it's more or less guaranteed, a whale is doing something here, I'm going to join, you still need to trade with a stop. You still need to manage risk, regardless of what's going on. Volatility has still quite high, although of course much lower than last year. So hopefully you enjoy the presentation. If not, feel free to give me constructive feedback. That would be great. Or constructive positive feedback. And I would open the floor for. But thank you all very much for listening. So if you have any questions, please feel free. Either through the microphone or can you do it on chat? Yeah, I think you can do it on chat.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. Anybody, do you have any question, please? أي حدا عنده أي سؤال؟
أي حدا عايز يسأل بالعربي، أنا مش ناطق أصلي للغة العربية طبعا، بس بتكلم شوية كلمات، فحد عايز يسألني بالعربي تفضل. حاول أرد.
من الحضور الكريم أي حدا عنده أي سؤال أو مداخلة؟ تفضل.
Excuse me, I have a question. Good morning.
Yes, please. Yes. Please ask a question.
Yes, I have what are the factors for this high volatility for the cryptocurrencies and maybe Bitcoin?
Well, generally, in crypto markets in general, volatility is always quite high. But specifically now, I think one of the key factors is sentiment is quite focused on what are, big players doing. We've seen in the second quarter tweets from people like Elon Musk, mainly just Elon Musk, to be honest, are things that have really driven sentiment and have brought quite significant and fast changes to sentiment. So I think that's one of the key factors. Although in markets, generally volatility now is actually quite low. still cryptocurrencies are, pretty much all the time some of the most volatile instruments that you can trade. So that's why I recommend, caution if you're going to trade them CFDs. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, as we have seen with Bitcoin, like it went from 65 to almost 30 in minimum time.
Yeah.
So do you think when the central banks will create their crypto money, what will happen to these digital Bitcoins and Ether, and how they will stay in the market?
Well, I think one of the factors that makes Bitcoin popular for a lot of people is that, it's not official, it's not created by a central bank. It's a way for people who, for whatever reason, they don't like fiat currency. It's a way for them, kind of not to get out of the financial system, but to have an alternative. Having said that, Bitcoin is not really a currency in the normal sense of the term, because there's just not very many things that you can buy with it, and even the things that you can buy with it, there's not really that much reason to do so. It's more like an inflation defensive asset like gold than it is like a currency, because the value is quite volatile. The value is also very high compared with any currency pretty much out there. And I mean, the supply is limited. That's something else to consider. Total supply is about 21 million. We've now got about, I think, 18.6 million roughly in circulation, much of which has been lost. So for the average person, there's not really that much point to pay for something in Bitcoin to use it like a currency, because many people think that in 10, 20 years or more than that, the value will almost certainly be higher. Like you wouldn't use gold as a currency, you wouldn't go into a shop and ask to pay with a bar of gold. So, I mean, the same kind of idea with Bitcoin. So, I mean, I think basically, in short, digital currencies created by central banks have a kind of a different role, just a different role completely from Bitcoin. But that's just my opinion. I'm not an expert on the future of crypto. I'm just a trader. So that's just my view personally.
Yeah, thank you. And if Bitcoin will remain as gold, so what about Litecoin? Can we buy with it in the future? Do you think?
Oh yeah, quite possibly. I think you can. I mean, like right now, I think the focus of cryptocurrencies as actual currencies is probably on utility coins, like, for example, Crypto.com coin. I mean, that's one of the ones that's probably most used, like, actually as a currency, because the value is very low. It's only worth about 10 cents, I think, last time I checked. Crypto.com coin, for example, value is very low. I mean, and it has its own in terms of payments, through the app, and various other, exchanges coins, not Binance coin, obviously, because the value is very high there. So I think, yes, quite possibly is the answer. But I mean, with Litecoin and with kind of cryptocurrencies that have been around for longer, given, the relatively high values, and given that, the supply is quite limited, I think it's probably less likely that they're going to be used seriously. I think adoption as currency is probably going to focus on the ones that have lower values and the ones that have relatively more stable values and, their own like kind of native systems for payments, such as, coins offered by exchanges. But I mean, again, I would stress that's just my view. Maybe, Litecoin will be more accepted. It doesn't seem that likely to me immediately. Yeah. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Anytime.
حضورنا الكريم، أي أحد عنده كمان أي استفسار بإمكانكم توجيه السؤال باللغة العربية.
Hello.
تفضل أستاذ جمال.
Hi, Michael.
Hello.
Why has the UK banned finance?
I don't know. I haven't really been following it, to be quite honest. I haven't actually heard about that. Sorry. I haven't been following it. I mean, like in general, like why has the UK banned Binance? I mean, I'm just kind of like guessing here. Why would they do this? I mean, presumably it's just a regulatory issue. I mean, within the FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, which is the British regulator, generally they've been looking at cracking down on cryptocurrencies for quite a long time, because there's a lot of scams involved. You know, as you know, obviously with transferable crypto, there's lots of scams involved. And you know, it's something, you know, it's not regulated. Most kind of crypto products aren't regulated, and there aren't really many guarantees. So for some regulators, it's easier for them just to ban it, just get rid of it. But I actually, about the UK specifically, I actually haven't checked, so I'm afraid I can't answer that question for you properly. Sorry.
That's fine, thank you. And one more question: where do you think Bitcoin is headed?
I think it's headed up sooner or later, but you know, I mean, I would say that I'm a little bit biased. You know, don't take that for face value, because as we explained in the presentation, you know, I mean, the general factors there in favour of Bitcoin, I think, are still like really quite strong. There's very few ways to get interest on deliverable or transferable assets, and I mean, while inflation is out of focus now, that's true. It's still there, and it's still likely to increase. It's pretty much impossible for any major central bank to have a rate above 1, I think at least 2. So, you know, for the time being, certainly I think it is heading up, and it looks quite positive. It just might not do that immediately. It depends a lot on sentiment. I think the catalyst, as we discussed, might well come from economic events. But I mean, equally, it might just come from a tweet. That's the thing with crypto. You can, sure.
Last question, please. Do you think more countries are going to adapt what El Salvador has done with Bitcoin?
Yeah, possibly. I think quite possibly they will. I mean, the thing is, in the case of El Salvador, if you look at the Salvadorian currency, I can't remember what it's called, to be honest, but if you look at the Salvadorian currency, you know, it's partially driven by, you know, the weakness and, you know, like ongoing, like really strong downtrend of that currency against the dollar. And the fact that, you know, El Salvador depends quite heavily on imports. Whereas with Bitcoin, you know, I mean, its value is obviously not stable at all against the dollar, but, you know, arguably it's a better store of value than, you know, an exotic currency from Central America that nobody's heard of, you know. And, excuse me, if you look at some currencies in some countries, in Africa, like Zimbabwe, for example, why haven't they accepted Bitcoin officially, made it legal tender before now? I really don't know. I mean, it seems like kind of not a no-brainer, but it seems like something that would make sense in a situation of, you know, very high inflation and economic distress. But as we were saying before, as we were just saying, you know, Bitcoin as a currency is not ideal because the value is so high and the value is so volatile. You know, that's just my opinion. And also, you know, it's something that kind of tends, if you look at the point of view of basic economics, you know, if you think about it, like if you are from Egypt, let's say, and you've got an Egyptian pound, okay, it can be volatile in the past, actually, when it was floated. But, you know, if you get 10 Egyptian pounds, you know that you can buy that with that, like a bag of crisps and a can of Pepsi, for example. And you could probably do that with the £10 for the next at least several months. Whereas with Bitcoin, if you've got 0.0001 Bitcoin, let's say, you have no reliable indicator that is going to be worth or what it can buy you in the next month, let alone the next 6 months. So it's just not really very useful, I think, as a currency, Bitcoin specifically, as far as the average person is concerned. I mean, I think the question with El Salvador as well, final point, and then I'll move on to the next question, because, you know, this has been quite in focus. The other question with El Salvador, I think, is adoption. You know, many people there are unbanked. Lots of people in El Salvador, they don't have smartphones that are capable of using apps. And, you know, okay, they can airdrop, the government can airdrop Bitcoin to Salvadorians. How much is that going to cost? The airdrop, the latest thing I heard was like the day before yesterday. I think they were saying they wanted to give 0.05, is that right? Bitcoin roughly, up to per person. And assuming half of all El Salvadorians take that up, it's going to cost something like $100 billion. Where does the money come from? So I think there's lots of questions. You know, I think the answer is quite possibly yes, But, there's lots of questions about, like, how practical, how many countries actually want to make that initial investment in, to set up. So I think probably yes, but, there's question marks over it. Yes. And thanks, that's a great question. That's a good question, yeah.
يعطيك العافية.
Thank you.
مرحبا.
مرحبا. أهلا.
اسمي فارس أبو زياد. عندي سؤال لو سمحت.
تفضل أستاذ فارس.
امبارح بالمؤتمر ببدايته تكلم نائب المحافظ البنك المركزي إنه الكريبتو كرنسي أصلا ممنوعة بالأردن وممنوع التداول فيها والاحتفاظ فيها. فسؤالي إنه إحنا هلا بندوة اليوم للكريبتو كرنسيز وبنتناقش بارتفاعاتها وهبوطاتها، يعني كيف إحنا ممكن نستفيد أو نتناقش بشيء أصلا ممنوع بالأردن، أو إنه كيف ممكن نستفيد منها أو شو تأثيرها علينا إذا إحنا مثلا ما بنقدر نشتريها، فارتفاعاتها أو انخفاضاتها شو راح تضرنا أو كيف ممكن نستثمر فيها أو نستفيد. فبس إنه لو سمحت توضح لي إنه جلسة اليوم اللي بنتناقش فيها عن الكريبتو كرنسي اللي أصلا ممنوعة بالأردن، كيف يعني فوائدها أو أضرارها أو كيف الإفكت تبعها، شو بالنسبة لنا، شو راح يفرق معنا، كيف ممكن نستفيد أو كيف ممكن نربط بين إنه اليوم جلسة بيتكوينز وهي أصلا ممنوعة بالأردن. يا ريت توضيح لو سمحت.
اوكي حاضر اتفضل. في الاساس يعني انا مش هشجع حد طبعا يعني يستثمر او يتداول في حاجه مش قانونيه او حاجه ممنوعه طبعا. بس بالنسبه لنا كمتداولين الوضع ده العملات الرقميه ممنوعه. هنحاول نبص على ارتباط العملات الرقميه بالاصول او بالرموز يعني كعقود اخرى زي مثلا
بتقدر تجاوب بالانجليزي ما عندي مشكله. لو سمحت تقدر تجاوب بالانجليزي. You can speak in English, no problem.
Yeah, alright, sure, I'll speak in English. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, basically, you're looking at correlations. You're looking at the relationship between different categories of instrument, like for example, gold and Bitcoin. For some time over the last couple of months, it's had an inverse correlation. So generally speaking, as Bitcoin's gone up, gold's gone down. As gold down, and at other times, we've seen that it's been more like a direct correlation on the context and depending on the circumstances. So the possible correlation between Bitcoin and other categories of instrument, cryptocurrencies in general, is one factor. That's certainly a way that we can benefit is just by looking at a chart of Bitcoin, not actually doing anything if it's illegal. Just looking at the chart and seeing what's going on, and comparing that with other charts. And I mean, equally, I think it's an important measure for sentiment, generally speaking, markets. So there isn't any specific correlation, I would stress, between indices and Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. Generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, if cryptocurrencies are going up and they're making gains, then you can usually expect that risk appetite is quite high, and indices and shares, particularly kind of small cap shares and tech shares, are probably also going to go up. When risk appetite is quite high, and when volatility is relatively low. That doesn't always work. I just want to stress that. I mean, right now, volatility based on the volatility index of the S&P 500, the VIX, is very low, but cryptocurrencies are also, relatively speaking, quite. So yeah, I think basically what you should do, Mr. Ferris, is don't do anything illegal. Obviously, I'm not encouraging you to do something illegal if you're in Jordan and it's illegal in Jordan. But you can look at a chart and you can see how does this chart affect other instruments. That's certainly something that you can do. I mean, in forex generally, and also in other categories of CFD like commodities, correlations are really, really important, and they're one of the ways that we as traders get more information about what's going on in markets. So that could potentially be quite useful, and hopefully that answers the question. Sorry about my habit. I tried.
شكرا.
Fine. Any more questions? Anybody? Please feel free.
أي أحد من الحضور عنده أي مداخلة أو استفسار؟ حضورنا الكريم أي سؤال أو استفسار؟ Okay, Mr. Michael, really I would like to thank you for sharing your experience with us today, and we hope to see you next time, but physically. Thank you,
No,
sir.
hopefully that would be great. Yeah, Cyprus and Jordan are quite close. Yeah, so that would be great. And
Well, I will come anytime, sir, and really thank you for sharing your experience with us. حضورنا
Thank you very
الكريم إن
much for
شاء
inviting me.
الله. Yeah. حضورنا الكريم، أعتقد الآن ما فيش أي سؤال أو استفسار لمستر مايكل.
Thank you, Michael, for the meeting.
That's okay. Thank you for attending. And I wish you all, I'd like to remind you all to trade responsibly, please, if you do choose to trade. Thanks very much for attending. And good luck. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. حضورنا الكريم إن شاء الله راح يكون عندنا جلسة قادمة كمان بحدود 10 دقائق. البانل ديسكشن راح يتناول موضوع الديجيتال كرنسيز مع مجموعة من الخبراء الاقتصاديين واللي عندهم خبرة كافية للحديث عن الديجيتال كرنسيز وللمهتمين فيها. فانتظرونا بأقل من 10 دقائق إن شاء الله. شكرا لكم جميعا.